fake moon landing. It's conspiracy. We're glad to have you on board with us. If you have any questions or comments for our guest, call us at 801-254-5855. That's 254-5855. We'll be glad to take your calls. Now, I had a question, Mr. Allen, that I've been wanting to ask you since I heard you were going to be on the air. And I don't know if you know the answer, but I would be interested in hearing it if you do know, if there's any evidence. Did Russia know from the start that this all was faked, that it was produced in Hollywood? By Disney, I guess, huh?
Yes, Russia did know. They knew all along. Russia were trying to get to the moon as well. And they had a major problem with their moon rocket called the N-1, which had exploded on the launch pad, and it was not being very successful. The driving force behind the Russian space program was the chief designer, Sergei Korolev, who had very unexpectedly died after an operation in 1966. There was nobody to take his place, and so the whole Russian program was a little disorganized. But they were fully aware of the ability that they had to get to the moon. In fact, right now in London, there is an exhibition of Russian cosmonaut equipment, craft in the Science Museum in London. And they certainly had a moon landing rocket, they had the moon landing equipment, and they were going to attempt it. Now, when asked if they were going to do this, they said, yes, we're going to land on the moon, but only when we can ensure the protection of the cosmonauts because of the dangers of the radiation in space. So the question then arises, well, if they were fully aware of the dangers of radiation, how come they didn't blow the whistle if they'd seen America doing it? And then we start to get into politics, high politics. If you recall back in those days, there was the Cold War going on, there was the space race, there was the Vietnam War, there was assassination of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King. There was a great deal of unrest and civil disturbance going on in the late 60s.
Marcus, I'm sorry to interrupt you, sir. This is Josh Stockwell. We're going to break. We're going to hit some commercials here. Can we pick up with that as soon as we come back then?
Okay, we'll continue then.
Excellent. Ladies and gentlemen, you're listening to K-Talk Inside the News, and we will be right back with more of why the landing on the moon never happened.
Doesn't display all info about conditions and objects behind vehicle. See your local dealer for financing details.
Hey, hey, mama said the way you move gonna make you sweat, gonna make you groove.
Here on Inside the News, we're back with our Conspiracy Thursday, and we're talking about something that Dan Aykroyd as an actor mentioned in the movie Sneakers, where he was like the big conspiracy buff in the movie Sneakers, and he mentioned that the moon landing never happened. That was the first time I had ever heard of it, was when I was watching that movie. And now, well, hold on just a second, folks.
Glad to have you back, folks. We are here talking about the fake moon landing. Were you able to get that to work, Josh? We've got phone problems again.
Just a couple technical difficulties there. Marcus, do we still have you with us?
Thank you.
Oh, you're good. You're still here. Okay. Thought maybe something had happened there. Before we get back on the subject, we did have a call. Okay, so you were discussing all the stuff that was going on around the time that the moon landing supposedly happened. It was a time of great tumult, so to speak. Would you mind getting back into that again?
Yeah, it was really to look at the fact that why didn't the Russians blow the whistle if because they were very much the protagonist in this space race. And if it was possible America had not done what they said they'd done, the Russians would immediately say, oh, no, look, they didn't do it, this is why. But Russia never did that. They never came out and said, we think there is a problem with the Apollo moon landings. And the reason for that is nothing really to do with the space race, it's to do with politics. At the time, the Russian government was obviously very different from any government in the West, especially in America. So who would have blown the whistle? Who would have said, I don't think it's real? The other problem with that is that in 1969, there was a treaty signed between Russia and West Germany. And the treaty was for the supply of Russian natural gas into West Germany and into Europe. Now, Russia, as we know, has enormous reserves of natural gas. They had then and they do now. So how come it was possible to sign this treaty for the supply of natural gas into Western Europe, as it was then, without America getting upset about it? Well, America did get upset about the signing of this treaty. And Henry Kissinger, who was Foreign Secretary at the time, or Secretary of State, tried to prevent it happening. But Russia was determined, because that was their main source of income, the supply of natural resources, in this case natural gas. And in order to supply it, they needed pipes, huge pipeline from Siberia into Western Europe. But Russia didn't have the means to make that pipeline, but West Germany, through their engineering companies of Thyssen and Mannesheim, did have the technology. So you can check it out quite easily. It's called Gas for Pipes. And it was a supply of natural gas into Western Europe by the Soviet Union as it was then. So ask yourself a simple question. Would Russia have jeopardized a major financial and commercial contract by just saying, oh, we didn't land on the moon? It doesn't bother them. That's not what they're concerned about. They just get on with their space program anyway, and they earn the income from Europe, the supply of natural gas, which was signed within a few months of Apollo 11 landing. So the two are running parallel to each other. It seems very unlikely that Russia would have done that.
You know,
in fact, they didn't.
The supply of natural gas from Russia to other parts of Europe is still a big issue today, and has a lot to do with the current geopolitical problems that we see in Eastern Europe. So, to see that, you know, they would want to stay hush-hush so that they can make a couple $2 billion, it makes perfect sense.
Exactly.
The question that I have for you, Marcus, is when you start looking into something like this and you see a production of such scale, such a large-scale lie, supposedly, that was put across like this, what was the motive from the beginning?
It was, okay, that's a good point. What would be the motive in creating such a lie? I think you've got it right there. The reason was politics. The reason was America, as you well know, America is a country which does not have the option of coming second to anybody. They were not going to come second. They were going to fulfill President John Kennedy's original promise to land a man on the moon before the end of the decade. He made that promise, he made that statement in May 1961 in the Joint Houses of Congress, and he was, as we know, assassinated November 1963, and it was necessary to fulfill his challenge because it would demonstrate leadership of American values. This is fine. This is what politics is all about. In order to do it, it had to be seen to be done. Hence, it was going to be shown live on television, as we know. In order to be shown live on television, the one thing that was necessary to avoid was the death of an astronaut. Now, radiation tends to kill people. There was no possibility of failure. Therefore, it was necessary to have a plan B. Plan B would be, okay, let's show everybody the landing on the moon, and they will believe it. It may sound a little incongruous that if you tell such a big lie, it won't get found out.
Well, how many people were believing that there was an alien invasion when they were listening to that radio show? There wasn't even visual at that point.
That's right.
What was the name of that?
World.
War of the Worlds.
War of the World.
Yeah, Orson Welles' famous
Orson Welles.
broadcast in 1938.
Let me interrupt you for just one sec, Marcus. The thing that I find kind of interesting here is that we have all of this technology and so forth. We're losing the space race. They'd been into space, we had only been in 20% of the number of hours they'd been in space. They had all of the technology in their favor. But and I assume that people in Russia now have come forth and have said that it's bogus. But we've got a couple of callers that want to ask us questions and make their comments about this. We're talking about the faked moon landing. And I'd like to get into some specifics about the photography. You're a photographer, you're a publisher, you're well known everywhere for the things that you've done on exposing what really happened. And folks, if you're listening, I was absolutely like Marcus Allen was. We're speaking to him in London when he said that he set out to disprove the naysayers, the doubters, the people that were conspirators, and then became himself a strong believer that the moon landing was faked. And that was, I have to say, the same with me. I said, there is no way in the world that moon landing was faked. And the more I get into it, the more, especially the photographs and the videos and even today, it looks like NASA is doctoring things and editing things. But let's go ahead and take a call from a listener on line 3. Go ahead, you're on the air with us.
How are you doing this morning?
Good. How are you doing?
Not too bad. I just had a question about the astronauts. The daytime temperature on the moon is about 268 degrees. How did they keep cool? They only had battery power, and I know I would have a tough time keeping my air conditioner in my car running for 72 hours just on a battery, keeping that cool. And then you mentioned the film, 35 millimeter film. If you put that in your oven at 268 degrees, boy, you're going to have some issues. So maybe he could discuss those two things and staying cool on the moon.
Good question.
Thanks for your call.
Hey, thanks.
Go ahead, Marcus, your response to that.
Yeah, how do you keep cool on the moon? That's a very good question, because the moon has a temperature range far greater than anything here on Earth. During the daytime, it's about 250 degrees Fahrenheit. It's in the shade, or at nighttime, it's about minus the same number. So it's a huge range. In order to keep cool, we're told they had spacesuits that circulated cooling water inside them, which is fine. Yes, that would remove heat. But the point is that on the moon, there is nowhere to put the heat. It's a vacuum. So where is the heat dumped? We're told it's frozen in the suit, and you've got the heat is removed by the way in which water freezes and removes heat. Yeah, fair enough. But there's no evidence of that happening. And the other point about the spacesuits is that they lasted up to 7.5 hours on one
battery pack.
One moonwalk. 7.5 hours. Now, if you speak to any sub-aqua diver wearing aqualungs, they will say that it's very difficult to have the amount of air you require for more than about 45 minutes.
Yes.
There is a serious doubt that the spacesuits could not only keep them cool, which is very doubtful given the amount of heat there, and by the way, there is an argument which says that, well, they landed early in the morning on the moon. One day on the moon lasts for 28 days. So they landed early in the morning, then the sun was very low. Yes, it was. The sun was low, and it was deliberately chosen so that it would show the shadows much more clearly. But the point is that the sun's heat, which is producing not only the light, but the heat, is as strong early in the morning. As soon as the sun hits you in space, you get very, very hot. And this has been demonstrated conclusively on the space shuttle, because the astronauts were very upset about the fact that their hands got so cold when they're on the space shuttle in the shadow of the Earth, i.e. when there was no sun, and they wanted heated gloves. And NASA said, well, tell us what the temperature differences are. And as soon as they came into the shadow of the Earth, the temperature plummeted by several hundred degrees.
Wow.
And they were supplied with electrically heated gloves. The point is that on the moon, the temperature range is huge, and would the batteries last as long? Now, in a vacuum, the only heat transfer is radiation. It's not convection, which we have here on Earth, where you get the atmosphere getting heated. If you put film into an oven, yes, it will melt. But if you put film into an oven that is basically a vacuum, it won't necessarily melt if it is protected to an extent, and it was protected by the camera itself. But it would still get hot through the radiation transfer of heat. Therefore, there are, again, questions and doubts that what we're told happened was actually the way in which it occurred. And this is what is questioned by many, many people. I don't question the Gemini missions. I don't question the Mercury missions, which happened before Apollo. I don't question that the shuttle is up there, the space station is up there. That's all for real. It's just Apollo because of where it went, and it went to the moon. Nobody has been back. This is the real question.
Now, what about the?
Have we not been?
We do have another caller who's been waiting. Let's take that call. Then I have a question about the other Apollo missions that were in trouble, where they also faked. So go ahead. You're on the air with us.
Good morning. I was wondering about the Hasselblad cameras that they used. Has Hasselblad ever claimed in any of their advertising that they were the cameras that went to the moon?
Did you get that question, Marcus?
No, not.
He was talking about the fact that Hasselblad cameras were used. Have they ever claimed, or have they ever made any advertising or anything out of the fact that their cameras were used?
Yes, they Hasselblad, a Swedish company, and there was a very, very good advertisement that Hasselblad put out at the time of Apollo 11, showing the cameras, and they were very proud of the fact that the cameras had been selected by the astronauts and by NASA to record this event. They haven't promoted it since then, to my knowledge. The Hasselblad camera that was used on the Apollo missions, called the lunar camera, it looks very similar to the Hasselblad camera you can actually now go into a shop and buy.
We've just got
So they are
30
very, very good
seconds
cameras.
left, guys.
But
I had one more
no, there was
question
no
Stanley
major promotion.
Kubrick's
In the same way that
involvement.
Kodak, who supplied the film, didn't capitalize on the fact. In fact, they said that they weren't going to capitalize on it because it was unfair on other film manufacturers. But it's interesting that very few of the people who supplied equipment, and Hasselblad is possibly the most prominent example, haven't really capitalized on it and promoted it since then.
Ladies and gentlemen, more with Marcus Allen and why the moon landing never occurred. We'll be right back in just a few minutes after a word from our sponsors.
As we get further away from Earth, we'll pass through the Van Allen belts, an area of dangerous radiation. Radiation like this could harm the guidance systems, onboard computers, or other electronics on Orion. Naturally, we have to pass through this danger zone twice, once up and once back. But Orion has protection. Shielding will be put to the test as the vehicle cuts through the waves of radiation. Sensors aboard will record radiation levels for scientists to study. We must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space. For this flight, it's time to head home. The upper stage of the rocket triggers separation. Orion's jets fire to turn it into the proper...
Ladies and gentlemen, what you've just heard is a NASA engineer explaining the Van Allen belts. And the gist of his message there was...
There's some challenges that need to be resolved before going to the moon.
In other words, it's something they haven't resolved yet. It needs to be... There needs to be a new technology. He does say that later. We need to invent the technology in order to get through the Van Allen belt. And it took 4 days for this spacecraft to reach the moon. I've read that the sheer weight of Apollo 11 would not happen with the power that those engines provided. Is that the case, Mr. Marcus Allen?
Yeah, but that is one of the major points, that the rocket that we all saw launched, about 1 million people, I believe, were watching the Apollo 11 launch, and there's no doubt that rocket was launched. But was it powerful enough to carry the equipment that we were told it did to the moon? It had to carry from Earth orbit 46 tons of equipment. In order to do that, it had to launch it from Earth. And it's possible to establish just how fast that rocket was traveling by measuring the speed it took to get from launch pad up into, say, 5 miles up. And the calculations indicate that it was not powerful enough. It could launch into Earth orbit, and that has been done many times, but was it powerful enough to go to the moon with the additional equipment needed? And the answer is very unlikely. But this is not something that is discussed to any great extent, and it's never happened. Well, it happened a total of 6 times that they landed with the Apollo missions. The last one is December 1972. There's just one point on that. That final mission, 1972, occurred in December 1972. 5 months earlier than that, President Nixon traveled to Moscow to sign the SALT I Treaty, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. This allowed Russia to stop competing with America on the Cold War, on the nuclear weapons, which is a completely new subject, and we don't have time to discuss whether that actually happened the way it did.
Yeah, we've discussed that on the air before, too. You know, really quickly, in that light, we had Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong and Michael Collins were the 3 astronauts. Have they ever talked about it? Have they ever revealed anything? And before you answer that, I remember an interview that I saw on YouTube. It was supposedly a movie producer, I guess working for Disney, saying that he was approached to make a movie that the Americans and the people around the world would believe. He came forth 20, 30 years after the fact and said, hey, I was the guy who produced that. I don't know if you've seen that or not, and I looked for it yesterday in advance. I couldn't find it right away, but maybe you're aware of that. But I think it's interesting that Neil Armstrong has always refused to take any interviews. And so what about Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong and Michael Collins? Have they come out publicly and said anything?
They've not said anything in so many words, no. They've possibly indicated it. And I think you're right when you say that they've never given interviews specifically about it. Neil Armstrong certainly had never given any interviews until his death 3 years ago. And by the way, his ashes are scattered in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Florida. The whole point is that all the astronauts were military, including Armstrong. He was in Air Force, he flew in Korea. He was a very, very good pilot. He was the right man to choose as an engineer. He was not interested in publicity. He retired as a college lecturer. The point is that he was a military man, as were all the astronauts, and they were under the national security oaths if they were told to do something by the commander-in-chief, the president, they would do it. Their only question might be, when ordered to jump, was how high, sir? They would not break ranks. The military have a great esprit de corps, whether they're Army, Air Force, Marine, Navy. They all have an esprit de corps. They do not let their comrades down. They will not break ranks. They will not say it. But they have been put in quite embarrassing situations where they have been asked to swear on a Bible that they landed and walked over the moon. And remarkably, many of them refused to do so, Neil Armstrong being one of them. He said, how do I know that the Bible is real? That's not the question that you would ask if you had done what you were being asked to do. You would say, how many Bibles do you want me to swear on? Of course I walked on the moon. But that's not the answer he gave. And again, these are some of the doubts that have arisen as a result of it, along with many of the other things. And the longer we go on, until we return to the moon, the questions will arise.
Folks, you're listening to Mr. Marcus Allen. We're talking to Mr. Allen in London. He's an expert. He's a photographer. He's a publisher with Nexus magazine. He is a person who has dedicated much of his career into discovering whether or not the moon landing was real or faked. Initially, he was supporting the position that it is real, and after all the research that he came up with, he's decided, like myself and Tom here, our co-host, and Josh, we think it's probably faked. But having said that, can you get into some specifics about being a photographer and from the standpoint of video and photographs? What are some of the things that really troubled you in your search?
Okay, well, that's a good point, because one can get quite specific on it. Now, most people are familiar with the photographs taken on the Apollo 11 mission. There are many other missions as well, obviously, but the Apollo 11 is the one most people are familiar with. If you go onto the nasa.gov website, you can see every photograph taken during the lunar missions. And there were 5,771 taken on the lunar surface, and another 25,000 taken during the flight to and from the moon. There's one particular sequence of photographs which most people would be quite familiar with, I think, which is the photographs taken by Neil Armstrong of Buzz Aldrin descending from the Eagle, the Apollo 11 lander. And you see him coming out of the hatch of the lander, on the top of the ladder, walking down the ladder, and then standing on the surface. And interspersed with those photographs, there are 8 of them altogether in the sequence, are 2 photographs showing one of the landing pads and one showing the refuse bag, a little white bag they threw out of the craft. Now, these 8 photographs were taken during a 3-minute sequence. That's how long it took for Buzz Aldrin to come down the ladder. The point I question is that each photograph is of a different scene, therefore the camera would have to be moved by Neil Armstrong, as well as setting a different aperture, because everything on the camera was manual operation. There was no automatic operation on the camera except the film wind. These 8 photographs in 3 minutes are quite easy to take if you have a viewfinder and you have an exposure meter, but they didn't have one. My question is, how did they get such well-exposed, well-composed, accurately photographed, accurately focused photographs in that short period of time without taking a second one of the same scene, which is the normal operation of a photographer? You take lots and lots of photographs of the same scene, you alter it, it's called bracketing, you alter the exposure to make sure that you will get at least one of them correct. The film used was Kodak Ektachrome transparency material, i.e. slide material. It was not print film. The development of that film took place after the alleged return from the moon, but how did they know that all the photographs were exposed correctly? They didn't. They had to adjust processing, but how did they know how much to adjust it by without doing a test? There is no evidence of a test exposure being used to determine...
You know, Mr. Allen, one of the things that I saw, the moon, from what I've been told in all of my science classes and everything else, that there's no atmosphere, there's no wind, there's no air. But yet I see the flag blowing in the wind up there on some of the videos I've seen.
No, this is a slight misconception. The flag is not blowing. The flag is being drilled into the ground by the astronaut erecting it.
Okay.
And he's sort of moving it backwards and forwards, like you would if you wanted to put a stick into the ground. You would sort of drill it into the ground. Therefore, it would appear to be waving. It's not waving because the only time you see any movement on the flag is when an astronaut is actually touching the pole. It's a slight misconception.
Okay.
And it was originally brought out as a subject in 1974 by a gentleman by the name of Bill Casing, who wrote the first book on the subject called We Never Went to the Moon. And
Wow.
there is a long story behind it. In the same way that people say, oh, there are no stars showing in the sky. Well, no, there wouldn't, because the exposure required to photograph something in direct sunlight on the lunar surface would be such a short exposure that the relatively dim stars would not feature on the film.
Mr. Allen, we are, and that's a good explanation. That's interesting. We're honest with both sides. We've got a caller online. Let's go ahead and take this call because we're down to a minute and a half, unfortunately. Go ahead, caller, you're live.
Okay. I'm wondering if any of the hosts or your guests have already watched the Mythbusters episode where they spent an hour recreating the pictures and photographs, and they created a to-scale diorama of the moon landing, and they verified the shadows and the lines of lighting and shading, and they already busted apart this myth. So I'm wondering if you guys have actually done that yet.
This was a Mythbusters episode?
Yes, it was.
Yeah,
I watched
it's already been done, and they completely, blew apart all the parts of conspiracy. So if you haven't watched that yet, you should, because I think you're going to be a lot more skeptical if someone is saying it never happened.
Well, thank you very much for your comments, caller. Thanks for listening this morning.
Yep.
We just have here another minute before we're done.
Do you have a response to that one, Marcus?
What, the Mythbusters episode?
Yes.
Yes, it's been completely demolished and debunked. Some Russian filmmakers tried to recreate what the Mythbusters had done and demonstrated quite clearly that they had used surface material that was too light, it reflected too much light, and they also, both of them, wore white coats which reflected the light. Therefore, the Mythbusters episode is debunked.
Nice. So the myth of the Mythbusters has been busted.
Yeah, it's been busted. It's probably the first time it's been busted, but on that one, I'm sorry, they didn't make it. They didn't do it straightforwardly enough.
How do people get more information from you, Marcus?
What's your website address?
The best website to go to, which will cover all this, and you can study it in your own time, is called Aulis. That's AULIS.com.
AULIS.com.
Boy, we really appreciate you being with us this morning. I really wanted to get into the BBC. A funny thing happened on the way to the moon. Anyway, let's go ahead and end the show. We'd love to have you on again, Mr. Allen. Thanks for being a great
I look
guest.
forward to that. There's much more to discuss.
All right, thank you.
All right, thanks for being here. You have a wonderful day. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be right back with more crazy conspiracy theories as soon as we get back after a word from our sponsors.